Glenn. And Mark, let me welcome you to the program. It's the 80th anniversary of the United Nations this year. What have the think tanks been saying about it?
Well, that's an interesting juxtaposition versus what Donald Trump recently told the General Assembly upon the 80th meeting of that body. Of course, American conservatives, many MAGA supporters, will give Trump a little bit of kudos for speaking out against the green agenda, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and speaking out against the insecurity of borders and way too much migration, things like that. However, it was a very mixed bag, as you reported Wednesday, to say the least, Mike, in terms of what Donald Trump had to say. But the ever busy Chicago Council on Global Affairs, arguably one of the busiest think tanks in the world, a close cousin of the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, the former leader of Chatham House is now leading the Chicago Council. Well, they brought out another one of their surveys amid the appearance by Trump at the UN. This is the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy being involved. It's also the 50th anniversary of these ongoing Chicago Council surveys about various issues. And Lester Crown, the Crown family, keep in mind, is a defense industry related family, General Dynamics. So there could be some biases there, some things to think about. Anyway, there's some just well enlarged bullet points here I'll share on screen just to very quickly summarize what's going on. We have the CCGA survey, key findings. Two-thirds of Americans say the U.S. should be more willing to make decisions within the United Nations, even if it means the U.S. will sometimes have to go along with policies that aren't its first choice. There tends to be a much more Democrat than Republican support of the UN and its policies. Majorities of Democrats and independents support this compromise approach compared to just 4 in 10 Republicans. And there's a couple more brief bullet points that round out this survey. And this is especially interesting. Let's show this one. Largest ever partisan gap. 4 in 10 Americans view strengthening the UN, and this keeps coming up in this survey, the idea of strengthening the UN as a very important goal for the U.S., similar to attitudes over the past 50 years of this Chicago Council survey. And here it gets a little more interesting. Democrats are far more likely than independents or Republicans to say strengthening the UN is a very important U.S. goal for foreign policy. And this is the largest partisan divide on this UN question in the entire 50 years of the Chicago Council's polling. The Chicago Council used to be called the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. Of course, the original CFR in New York had a lot to do with bringing the UN into existence when the League of Nations failed. Lots of propaganda at that time for world governance. Anyway, this is the only chart I'll show as part of this Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey. Let's put this up there. It's interesting in its own way. And the question is, should U.S. leaders consider UN resolutions in policymaking? When you look at a great deal to the answer to that question, you see Republicans fairly low and Democrats much higher and independents in between. But when you say that U.S. leaders should consider UN resolutions to a fair degree, you actually see Republicans and Democrats almost on the same level, the orange and the blue there at the second line down. And that is mainly the MAGA movement that creates that schism there. And when you read through the survey, you kind of get the impression that the MAGA movement is almost another political party unto itself that rode the Republican banner to get into office. That's a theory of mine at this point. It seems to be panning out more and more. Now, in association, Mike, with that survey, there was a discussion at the Chicago Council headquarters in Chicago. And here is the title page to that, The Future of Multilateralism, the UN at 80 and Beyond. And I have a slide that shows the speakers and a very quick summation of what they had to say. This forum was on the 22nd of September to go along with that survey. The moderator, Paul Post, University of Chicago political science professor, he said a key item is the future of multilateralism as embodied in the UN system. Important words there. The UN is a system, not just a forum. And Professor Ian Hurd of Northwestern University, he had this to say: the International Criminal Court is a UN reform, a freestanding institution, when the idea of UN reforms was brought up during the discussion. And lastly, Juliet Sorensen, a Loyola law professor, she suggested eliminating the permanent five veto. And that, of course, would have a lot of ramifications. And she said the UN Charter is amendable in regards to critics of the UN and some of the things they have to say. And Leslie Vinja-Murray, as I mentioned, the former head of Chatham House, is now leading the Chicago Council. Chatham House, the New York CFR, the Chicago Council are birds of a feather here. They're ideological cousins. She had this to say: if turning up is what matters, like showing up somewhere, then the sheer popularity of the forum with world leaders is a clear indicator that the UN is widely viewed to be politically relevant and an important platform for shaping international discourse and influencing public opinion. She also had this to say, there's one more quote from her: when measured by its ability to deliver impactful material solutions to the most critical global problems, however, the UN's relevance looks far worse. Leslie Vinja-Murray said, it's been radically diminished, she went on to say, by the US decision to delay critical budgetary support. Now, much of the discussion by that panel portrayed the UN as little more than a forum and a platform, but actually the UN is a lot more than that. And there's some historical things to talk about with regards to that briefly. Of course, the UN Charter was only 5 years old when a war under UN auspices, the Korean War, was fought starting in 1950 to 1953. And my first newspaper boss who served in Korea said that everybody called it a UN war or UN-led military operation. That's what he and other soldiers were calling it. Anyway, this article from 1996 revisits an important facet of the UN, and this is having to do with Michael New from the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington, mid-1990s. The court-martial goes easy on the Army medic Michael New, convicted of disobedience and discharged for refusing UN insignia and refusing UN command. And Michael New at the time was the 22-year-old American soldier and medic who was court-martialed for refusing to accept foreign command on a United Nations operation. And lastly, this is just a reminder, this next slide, Mike, that on the UK Column website is an interview I did almost exactly 1 year ago with Daniel New, the father of Michael New. At the time, Michael New chose not to be on the interview with us, but it talks about Michael New's experiences in the mid-90s as an Army soldier in Germany when he showed up for revelry one day and they just said, you're going to put on the UN insignia, you're going to put on the UN berets and the armbands, and you're going to serve under UN command in Macedonia. And he refused because on constitutional grounds, he had only signed up to defend the US Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. So that shows some of the conflicts that sovereign nations can have with the UN system that the Chicago professor moderating that discussion talked about. Some interesting perspective there. And of course, that shows there's much more that Donald Trump could have talked about that would have made maybe a better case for him. But I think he went down a very perilous road and a very controversial one, criticizing the UN for supporting Palestine, which is one of the UN's brighter spots, of course. But maybe we can go more in extra, Mike, but that provides a pretty broad perspective for the time being.
Thank you, Mark.